everyone, it's Ryan Metzler here again, and today we're going to take a look at a game that initially released at Gen Con, and then was a huge hit at Essen 2014, and that game is Imperial Settlers by Portal Games. Ignacy is a good friend of mine. He's designed all types of great games, and this is no exception. This one's a card game in the lines of 51st State, or A New Era, their New Era, I guess it's called. It's a card game where you're building a tableau and using workers, as well as different resources you can generate from that tableau in order to build things, take actions, produce victory points, and sometimes interact with your opponents in order to hopefully prevent them from doing the same things. As I said, it's very much in the same line. It's an evolution of those previous two games. So let's see how the evolution has progressed. We'll see how the game plays, what's new kind of from the other two games. We'll see what I think of it at the end, and hopefully you can make your own opinions from that. So here you can see the components for Imperial Settlers all set up. Now, I'm showing you one player's area, but each player will have their own area that will look the same, and each player will have their own deck of cards, be they be the Romans or the Egyptians, or they be the Japanese. Right now we're going to be looking at the Roman player, but there are also barbarians, Egyptians, and Japanese, which you could be playing with. Egyptians and Japanese being a little bit more advanced, and we'll talk about them very briefly. But the basic idea of this game is that you're going to be building a tableau around this little central tile right here. You're going to end up with production buildings, which are going to give you more goods at the start of each round, feature buildings, which are going to have different types of kind of static effects on them, and action buildings, which you'll be able to place workers on, these little guys here, in order to activate and have some type of effect. At the start of the game, each player has their own faction-specific deck. This is the one for the Romans, and those are the other three. In addition, they're going to have two common cards that come from this deck right here, and two of their own faction cards in their hands, and they'll be using these cards to play the game. Now, the first part of each round is going to be the lookout phase, and you're going to deal out a number of common cards from this common deck equal to the number of players plus one. In addition, each player is going to draw the top card of their faction deck and add it to their hand. So right now, we would put out these cards. Let's say that we're playing a 5-player game, and we would deal out, 4-player game. It doesn't play 5. We're going to play a 4-player game and deal out 5 cards. So there'll be 5 cards available. Then, starting with the player that has the start player marker, this marker right here, you're going to draft one of these cards and place it into your hand. So based on whatever factors they like, they're going to take one of these cards and add it to their hand, and each player will do the same, of course leaving one card left over, which is then discarded. So all of these would be taken by the players, and we would discard the last one. Then again, you're going to deal out 5 more cards for 4 players. And this time, instead of starting with the start player, you're going to start with the last player, who will draft a card and add it to his hand, on each other player in reverse order drafting a card, until we finally get back to the first player, who drafts their card, and the last one is thrown away. So each round, every player will get 3 new cards, 1 from the faction deck and 2 from the common deck that they're going to draft. After we're done with the lookout phase of a round, we're going to move on to the production phase, and we're going to produce goods that we can use for that round. Now, each of these boards, Roman, Barbarian, Egyptian, and Japanese, is going to have their own production. For example, right here, printed on this one, it says that we get 2 workers, we're going to get 1 raid token, which are these little swords, we're going to get 1 shield, and this will be pretty much the same for everybody, but we're going to get 1 wood, and we're going to get 1 stone. And these goods, depending on what you get, can vary from each different type of faction that you have. And so we're going to produce all of these goods. In addition, in future rounds, if we were to have made any deals, we would produce goods from those deals, and if we were to have any production buildings, they would produce their goods as well. And that is essentially the production phase. Then we would move on to the action phase, which is the second to last phase in a round. And in the action phase, there are many things you can do. There are several different actions, so we're going to cover them one by one. The first you can do is you can build a building. So if we go ahead and look at our cards, each card will be laid out something like this. In the top left corner will be a cost to build. In the top right corner, if it's a faction card, there will be a cost to raise the card, which is to destroy the card for goods, be it your card or an opponent's. And then in this bottom section here, there's going to be a action or whatever the building does. And then at the bottom of the faction-only cards, like these ones right here, there's going to be the benefit of making a deal with this card. So you're going to use the cards for various different things. Let's cover each one of those actions right now. So the first action, as I said, is to build a location, and it's going to be looking at this cost in the top left-hand corner. This one right here says that it costs a wood and a stone to build. Well, it just so happens I have a wood and a stone. So I can discard 1 wood and 1 stone on my turn in order to build this card. Now, this is a production card. You can tell for several reasons. 1, it has a production effect listed on it, but 2, the roads from the card go left, right, and down. You can also tell that this is a common card because it has grass behind it. And if we look at my player board, grass is on the common side, and cement is on the faction side. So each of these boards is divided into 2 sides, common and faction, and you want to make sure you place your cards on the right side. So right now, my common card is going to go on the right-hand side, and it goes on the top because the roads go left, right, and down, and that's where the roads on the top go. Cards in the middle, feature cards, have roads going in all 4 directions, and cards on the bottom, action cards, have roads going left, right, and up. Production cards will produce their goods immediately, so I'm going to get 2 workers for building that, and they're also going to produce those goods at the start of each production round. So now that I've built this, it's no longer able to be raised. I can't make a deal with it because it never had that option, and so basically I'm done with that card until I find another way to use it. Now if we look at our buildings, we'll see that some of them have a cost of a building. You'll see this one right here has a cost of a building and 2 stone. At a later date, I could discard this building in order to pay the cost of building this one in addition to the 2 stone. So if I no longer want this production or I find this other building to be better, I could discard that building as part of the cost. In addition, you'll see that the faction buildings all have this concrete background, so if I were to build this feature-based action building, it would go in the center here on the left-hand side of my board. And that is the building action. The next action is making a deal. You'll see that cards at the bottom, faction cards in particular, have a thing that says make a deal. This one says make a deal for a card. If I have a food that I've acquired through another card, food of these little apples right here, I can pay that food in order to make a deal with this card. And I would slide this underneath my player board where it says deals. It would immediately produce a card, which allows me to draw either a faction card or one of the cards from the common deck, and it's going to produce that card at the start of each round. Now, of course, I would take an action, then the next player would take an action, the next player, until it got back to me. So my first action could have been to build this, and then my second one, if I had an action, could have been to make a deal by spending an apple if I had one in my area. The third type of action you can do is to raise a card. Now there are 2 ways to raise a card. You can raise cards from your own hand, and you raise them to get some goods that are printed in the top right-hand corner of the card on this ribbon. This one says raise to get a worker and a gold. Gold essentially being a wild resource in the game, but also needed for other things. So I could raise this in order to get those 2 goods. And I would raise this by spending 1 of these little raise tokens, which is this sword right here, in order to raise that card from my hand, discarding it and getting the printed goods, which I could then use for something else later. Of course, that takes an action. Alternatively, if you've accumulated multiple of these raise tokens through your production or through using an action on one of your cards, you can spend 2 raise tokens in order to raise a card that someone else has played in their area. So if somebody had built a building like this one in their area, you could spend 2 of these raise tokens to raise that building, and that would get rid of their building, flipping it over, and it would become a foundation. It would also give them 1 wood, but you would get the goods printed on their card and deprive them from a building in their area. Now, there is a special token that you have. Each player has 1 that they can place each round on one of their actions, which is this shield right here. You can place it on any card, and that increases the value to raise that card by 1. So for example, if my opponent wanted to raise this card now, it wouldn't take 2 tokens, it would take 3, which is much harder to get, and so you'd be looking for people to plan a way to accumulate those tokens in order to raise particular cards in your area. The next action I'd like to talk about is using an action card, but unfortunately, I don't have any action cards right now, so we'll skip to the last possible action, which is discarding workers in order to get resources or cards. So I have all of these workers, but I have nothing to use them on, so I can always discard 2 workers in order to get a resource or a card. So let's say I wanted to discard these 2 workers and pick up, for example, a food, and I'd place that in my area, and that would be my action for the turn. If I wanted to, I could discard the other 2 at the same time in order to take another resource or in order to draw a card. So it's whichever one I want, and I can use them multiple at a time. So I could, if I had 8 workers, I could discard all of them in order to get 4 resources or 4 cards or any combination of those various things. On my next turn, let's say I then built this action card. It costs me 1 food. So I would discard my food and place this action card out. We'll note that it's a common card, so it goes over here, and it's an action card, so it goes on the bottom. Once I've built this, it now has an action I can use, which would be my next turn to spend a worker. And that would allow me to choose one of my deals if I were to have a deal, which I do at this point. And I can immediately gain the good printed on it again. So not only do I get it when I built it, but I can use a worker, place them out here, and get that card again, accumulating more cards in my hand, which will allow me more options on my future turns. The players will keep on playing in this manner, taking one action at a time around the table until they pass, and everybody has to pass before the round will end. At the end of a round, you're going to lose all resources you didn't use and all resources that have been placed on your cards. So the only thing you're going to keep is the cards in your hand and any victory points you've managed to earn. So for example, this unused worker would be lost, and the worker on my card would also go away. However, there are ways to earn VP that you wouldn't lose. So for example, we have a feature card here. That's one of my faction cards. If I had happened to have 2 stone and a building I wanted to discard, I could have built this on my side in the feature area. And basically, anytime I build a gray building, you'll see that this happens to be a gray building as indicated by the color here. I don't have any other ones in my hand, but every time I built a gray building, I could either take a victory point, the little star, or I could take a gold, which is a wild resource. So you can accumulate victory points in-game through various different types of cards, be they action or features, or sometimes even production, that will allow you to get victory points that you can keep from round to round. But otherwise, you lose all of your other resources except for the cards in your hand, the cards you've played, and the victory points that you happen to earn. Then you would move on to the next round, of course, cleaning up everything and getting ready again, starting out with another lookout phase where you're going to seed cards, draw a card from your deck, and draft the ones from the common pile, go through another production phase where I now have more production, and I'm going to try and accumulate points through in-game actions and then cards that I've got built at the end of the game. So you'll play through 5 rounds in this manner, and at the end of the 5 rounds, you're going to get 1 point for each common building you have, and 2 points for each faction-specific building you have built out in your area. So it's a good idea to build more faction-specific buildings. And of course, as always, whoever has the most points at the end of the 5 rounds, including points they earned in-game and from their buildings they've built at the end, will be the winner. Well, there you have it. That is Imperial Settlers from Portal Games. Now, I want to go ahead and say right off the bat that this is a good progression from 51st State and A New Era, both of which are games that I liked quite a bit. The sheer amount of variety and the fact that you can place on other players' things in 51st State and A New Era, and the cards were kind of unorganized, made them difficult to learn. And this takes that whole thing. I mean, really everything that's there pretty much in those 2 games has been adapted to Imperial Settlers. But now you have a nice organizational scheme. You have those central boards that are having you position cards in specific areas in order to follow what they're doing. And the other 2 kind of did that, but there wasn't a board to help you organize it. The bits are fantastic in this one compared to the other ones where they were just okay. The factions are pretty easy to follow, and there's really only a few actions that you're taking, but the ways you can combine all of those actions, be they, building a building or raising or making a deal or whatever it is, give you a lot of choices from turn to turn, and those are going to get more and more as the game goes on from round to round, and you produce more cards, build more cards, produce more goods, and have more things that you can do. Now, so as I said, it's very simple, very streamlined, and very well put together. Now, when you add in the Egyptians and then even more so the Japanese, that gets a little bit turned on its head, and that's not saying this is a bad thing, it just increases the complexity of playing those 2. There's some special rules involved in the Egyptians and a lot of special things that you really have to pay attention to when you get to the Japanese. For example, with normal factions, the Romans and the Barbarians and the Egyptians, only the common cards can be raised. But when you get to the Japanese, all of your cards can be raised. However, they can use workers as samurai to help them protect their cards and make them harder to raise. So there's a whole different area that you have to think of there. And basically, if you don't have food, you're going to be in trouble. So make sure you have food if you play the Japanese. But the game has a lot of variety in its simplicity. So with that simplicity, there's still a lot of variety offered, a lot of things you can do, and it's going to change from game to game based on what cards you happen to come across. If that sounds good to you, or you liked 51st State or the New Area, definitely check this one out. That is Imperial Settlers from Portal Games.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock.